overview from your perspective. Basically, not backing up data at all. Now, as you can think of it, like, why would you get a backup product and forget to back up your data? Now, this is something that happens quite a lot for actually two reasons. So one of the reasons that we are not backing up data using our backup products, so in our case, we're talking about Veeam mostly. First of all, is because we have configured our backup environment once. So we decided to back up all of our workloads, which we currently have running, and the administrator is not exactly aware of whatever changes may be happening in the virtual environment. And if you set up Veeam Backup and Replication in a way that you just protect the current environment, a specific set of virtual machines, well, if somebody adds a virtual machine and does not tell the backup administrator, it may be quite difficult for the backup admin to actually figure out that there's some additional data that should be backed up. There's also a second thing that we actually see quite a lot because I understand the reason, because people are actually excluding specific disks from virtual machines, for example. The reasoning behind it, well, it's quite simple, right? We want to conserve our repository space. What happens, however, if those disks are dynamic? What happens if, for example, we've chosen the wrong SCSI adapter when we are detaching a particular disk from the backup? As I mentioned, it did happen quite a few times that our customer was absolutely certain that some data was being backed up constantly, but because of the exclusions that were made, this data was not protected at all. Now, allow me to try to share my screen. We will actually go to a bit of a demo right now. So you should be seeing my screen at the moment. And there are two things that can be done to actually overcome this using Veeam. Of course, there's more, because we can, I'll get to this in just a second. Let me just start Veeam 1 as well, because monitoring can also help you with identifying machines which are not being backed up at all in any case. But what happens if you're just using Veeam Backup and Replication? So those of you who already have Veeam, well, yes, you know this console. There is a backup job that we can go and configure. And what we're going to have here is actually not a good practice, right? This is our lab environment. Like I mentioned, the worst practices are not always applicable. We don't really care about them if we're looking about lab deployments. So what is actually happening here is I've chosen specific virtual machines that should be backed up. So in my case, this is just an Exchange machine. It's fine if your backup administrator and your virtualization administrator are in constant contact. Everybody knows what's happening and what set of data should actually be protected. Now, the good practice with Veeam is actually not to do this, so not to choose specific machines, but choose some sort of a high-level container. So for example, in my case, because I do not have a cluster, those can be individual hosts. So basically, every single virtual machine running on this particular host will be protected. Now, the reason why this is simpler is because this host is basically a container. So if today this host contains, let's say, 3 VMs, we are going to have a backup of 3 VMs. If, let's say, in 2 weeks, we are going to expand our infrastructure, it's going to contain 12 VMs, automatically Veeam is going to add those additional 9 VMs to the backup job and make sure every single piece of our infrastructure is actually protected. So keep it in mind, there are containers which can be chosen, and it's always a good idea. So it can be a host, it can be a virtual machine folder if you have them defined. It can be, for example, a data store. So whenever basically you put something on a particular data store, or if you're using tags within vSphere, yes, we can use those as well. Now, there is a second side of this, which you have to be aware of, is what happens if you have a larger environment. And instead of having individual hosts, those hosts are actually a part of a cluster. If you have a cluster, excuse my drawings, I'm not known for a beautiful work of art when I'm drawing with my mouse. So if you have a cluster, what I did just a second before, so adding a specific host, this is a very bad idea once again, right? It's a much better idea to add an entire cluster to your data protection environment rather than an individual host. Why? Because let's say today I'm backing up this host. So yes, I have a backup of a virtual machine, so full backup, incremental, so on, so on. If I have a second backup job, which is backing up this host, and my virtual machine, for whatever reason, migrates between cluster nodes, which is absolutely normal, right? We have DRS. This is basically what DRS was made for, migrating virtual machines on the fly without us even realizing it. And if a different backup job is pointing to a different virtualization host, this second backup job is again going to create a full backup and an entire backup chain. So what you're seeing right here are basically two backup chains without any deduplication and compression in between them. So something that automatically becomes suboptimal. If you specify the entire cluster, wherever a specific virtual machine travels within a cluster is always going to be protected, so you do not have to worry about it absolutely at all. Second thing I mentioned, exclusions, and this is like a whole another topic. And I would say we are a bit guilty when it comes to exclusions and the misunderstanding that comes along with it, because if you look at how we handle exclusions, so by default, we are processing all of the disks, right? So this is normal. Yes, this is the behavior that we would like to have. Second option, typically the system disks, this is great. And now keep in mind, this is called exclusions, and exclusions, selected disks. Now, this selected disk option does not exclude those disks which you choose, it includes those disks that you choose. So it's not really that, let's say, straightforward when you're trying to define it, because if I choose selected disks, if I choose my, for example, two SCSI adapters, those disks will be backed up. They will not be excluded, as you might probably guess from the exclusion tab which we are clicking, but in fact, those will be the disks which are going to be processed. So again, something to remember, because we actually had a customer who was trying to exclude some of the disks. So for example, of course, that customer wanted to back up the system disk, so he wanted to exclude, let's say, all the other disks that were attached to this virtual machine. As it happened, he had all the data disks, and the customer did not have the system disk because it was excluded from the job by accident, right? So again, small thing, but such an overlook can actually cause you a lot of trouble if you have any kind of disaster recovery scenario. So, like I said, small thing, but yeah, keep this in mind. If you're also trying to identify certain virtual machines which were not backed up, I'll go back to my lab here for a second. Veeam One can also help you with this. So Veeam One, in very short, because it's a much less popular solution than Veeam Backup and Replication, allows you to do monitoring of both virtual, physical, and backup environments in a whole, right? So this is a Veeam product. It allows you to do that. Now, one of the things that are by default available in Veeam One, if you're also using Veeam Backup and Replication, are virtual machines with no backup. So you can immediately see which virtual machine has absolutely no backup job defined whatsoever. So if you already have this information, well, sorry, that's a very bad zoom that I've made here. If you already have this information, you know that those virtual machines are not part of absolutely any backup job, so they are actually excluded from your data protection policy. And this is taken by default, so that way you automatically know when or if those virtual machines should be taken into consideration. And what's also important is that Veeam One can actually assign specific tags to those virtual machines. So for example, let's assign a tag saying, okay, no virtual machine backup. And then remember, in Veeam Backup Replication, you can actually run a backup job based on this particular tag. So whenever you have a virtual machine that nobody cared about, nobody put in any backup job, you can just put them in some sort of temporary backup job, which will automatically take into account virtual machines without any kind of backup already created. So that's one thing to remember. As I said, very trivial, but believe me, it's something that we see quite a lot. Number 9, cutting corners. So cutting corners, this is something that I would say mostly deals with our data or backup storage policies, so to speak. So if you remember our best data protection rule, the 3-2-1 data protection rule, which says that we should have 3 backup copies on 2 different media, and one of those copies should be sent offsite. Now, this rule sometimes happens to be misunderstood, and I understand why, because, well, quite a lot of times we do not have the budget, for example, for the infrastructure, which is able to provide every single tier of our backup data. But sometimes it's because we were used to a backup solution which did not have certain capabilities or basically required us to do a specific type of backup. So for example, quite a while ago, it's been a couple of years already, backup solutions were, I would say, by default, sending data directly to tape. Right? So this was normal. If you're right now switching into Veeam, which is basically designed for virtual environments, and you try to do the same thing, well, of course, Veeam will not let you do this because Veeam is a solution which is heavily utilizing disks. But you may think, okay, so I will just put one backup on disks and then I will put everything on tapes because I always used tapes, so why not do this again? And in here, we actually get to the tiers of the backup and how those tiers can be utilized in your environment. So allow me to try to make a small drawing right here. So tier 0, what is a tier 0 and should we consider this to be an actual backup? So tier 0 is you using, for example, storage snapshots. As you hopefully know, there are certain storage arrays we can integrate with. So those can be like HP, it can be Dell EMC, it can be Lenovo storages. There's quite a lot of vendors that we can integrate with. And some people treat storage snapshots as backups, which is fine because it is a recovery point, but just the same as with a virtualization snapshot, a storage snapshot is not exactly a backup, right? Because if something happens to your storage, you are basically lost. There is no way for you to recover this data. Of course, we may have a scenario where you have a couple of specific storage arrays, you have snapshot replication set between them, but as I said, like for majority of the people, they just have one array from this particular vendor and they want to do storage snapshots on this array. So do not treat this as a backup, but very much feel free to treat it as an additional recovery point, as something we call the level 0 backup, which gives you the quickest possible recovery. Why? Well, storage snapshots are the quickest. They're not compressed, deduplicated by Veeam by default, right? It's all based on the storage array functionalities, so backup is not really part of this, and it gives you the quickest recovery possible. But let's not make it our only way of storing the backups. Of course, then we start with the backup job. So a regular backup job, this is something that Veeam creates, compressed, deduplicated backup file. Great, wonderful. This is like, let's say, the first step into having a complete data protection policy. But if you remember the 3-2-1 data protection rule, it says that 3 means that you should have 3 copies of your data. So one of them is a production copy, and you should have 2 backup copies at least. So of course, production copy, we don't really care about this, right? It's on your production. So tier 1 is the first backup which you actually created. So you need a second backup. Now, how to create a second backup and what are the repercussions of creating them in different ways? So this is where tier 2 and tier 3 come into consideration. Tier 2 is basically sending a backup copy to a different, let's say, block-based array, for example. So you can copy this data, for example, from storage array number 1 to storage array number 2. Not a problem, something that's gonna work just great. Keep in mind, however, that of course, block-based storages, basically arrays, are fairly expensive when it comes to storing data. So the question is, do you really want your entire data protection policy to be revolving around only block-based devices? If business requires you to store, 14 days of data, you should be fine. If business requires you to store, for example, 20 years of data, block-based arrays are most likely not going to be your favorite way of storing this. But let's say as a longer retention, fine. Not necessarily the safest way to store data because, well, it's a block-based array, so you most likely have to attach it to some Windows or Linux machine. Most likely you're going to be writing with commonly known protocols over SMB, over NFS or whatever, which means those are also susceptible to any kind of ransomware attacks. So this is where our level 3 backup comes into consideration. And those are basically tapes, or right now, those are also object storages. So this is the data which is sent for long-term retention, which we, as Veeam, hope that you will never have to recover in absolutely any way. Why? Well, because it's tape. Tape is sequential. Tape is not exactly fast when it comes to recoveries, especially compared with regular block-based repositories, but it's the safest way. Once you remove the tape from the tape device, once you send it into a bank or whatever safe, well, this data is basically the protection policy that you really want to have in case a disaster happens. A quick note, if one of our customers was ever attacked by ransomware, tape was the only way for them to be 100% certain that data was recoverable. Because no matter the security that was in place, usually ransomware was able to penetrate all layers of security, so basically attach itself to every single block-based repository and encrypt this data. Once you send data to tapes, yes, then you were absolutely safe. So cutting corners can be understood as, for example, using only regular backup, and block-based repositories. So we don't really think about ransomware. We don't really think about this quick recovery options given by storage arrays. So again, something that might seem simple, but just keeping in mind that having every single layer of data protection can be very beneficial if you are thinking of really securing the data. Number 8, and I have to say that I am personally, maybe not, let's say, in the Veeam sense, but whenever I do anything with my home lab, I am absolutely guilty of this point as well. So straight to production. And I would say the biggest problem we see with straight to production is updates. It's updates of two particular things when it comes to Veeam. One of them is Veeam Backup and Replication, which is being updated basically the second a new version goes live. The second thing that gets updated immediately by certain customers is, for example, vSphere or Hyper-V. So basically the virtualization platforms. Why could this be a problem? Now, we've finally released version 10 in the beginning of this year. And version 10, for example, dropped support for vSphere 5.5. You cannot imagine how many people called me saying that, okay, they upgraded Veeam to the newest versions and backups stopped working. I'm like, okay, so what is your version of vSphere? It's like 5.1 or 5.5. And I'm saying, yes, expected behavior. We dropped support because basically VMware dropped their support of this virtualization platform. And then, you know, there's the silence in the cell phone. I'm saying, okay, so the only way you can actually do it right now is basically reinstall Veeam, because there's no easy way to downgrade the versioning. So yes, you just have to install the older version. Or it can happen the other way around, and this can be a lot more problematic than upgrading Veeam. So for example, upgrading vSphere. And the reason why this can be a problem is because, of course, we as a technology alliance partner with VMware, we get information from VMware about how their products are being developed. So whenever VMware has, for example, a beta, like a closed internal beta of vSphere, let's say 7.0, we as a technology partner also get it, so we are able to adjust our products to work with the new versions. Now, in reality, what's going to happen is that the official version that comes out is slightly different. It's always slightly different than the version that was actually being tested by our developers, which means, first of all, that we need at least like 2 or 3 weeks for regression testing. And best case scenario, after those 3 weeks, we are able to release the product saying, yes, we have full support of this general availability version of vSphere. Or if we find some differences, then the development team has to sit down and adjust our functionalities in order to work with the changes that were implemented. And this can realistically take up to 3 months. So we also had scenarios where customers were so happy that the new version of vSphere came out, they upgraded, and again, Veeam stopped working. Why? Because certain APIs were simply not prepared, or certain, let's say, Veeam functionalities were not prepared to handle the API changes which were created in the new version of the virtualization platform. So keep this in mind. Basically, documentation is your best friend right here. Of course, we do our best to at least provide partial functionality. So even if you upgrade by mistake or you did not look into the support matrix, some things should work. But with certain versions of the virtualization platform, it's simply not possible. Sometimes it will just break. We have to basically fix it from scratch. So again, small thing, but keep this in mind. Security. This is something that, well, again, for me, this is a nightmare basically because, well, me as a pre-sales engineer, I have my demo lab, and my demo lab is quite simple. So let's go back to my demo lab. I can actually show you what's happening in here. So if you look, for example, at my networking in my demo lab, there is basically a single production network, so something that's not going to happen in any kind of production environment. So this is quite simple for me. If you look at my Veeam Backup and Replication console, there are, of course, permissions to be taken into account. And as you can see, every single person that I have here is a backup administrator. So basically, we're all admins. We are all the masters of the backup solution. Now, in the production environment, definitely not something that you want to have happening. So one of the problems with this is that Veeam basically allows you to provide permissions based on so to speak, a global level. So for example, once I have access to the console, I can see every single backup job, I can see every single machine. And the only way we can somehow limit this is by using the natively provided roles. So we have something called the restore operator, so a person who can only perform restores, but cannot create backups, cannot modify backups in any way. We have the backup operator, so this is the role which is allowed to create backup jobs, edit backup jobs, but is not allowed to restore anything. Of course, the administrator, the person who can do absolutely everything. Tape operator, so the person who is allowed to attach new tape devices, basically copy our backups to tapes. And we have a backup viewer, so this is a person who wants to see what's happening with the backup infrastructure, but is not allowed to touch anything. So basically, this is like a read-only principle. Now, utilizing those roles can be very beneficial, especially if you're looking at a scenario where, well, an audit may come because something got broken and you cannot exactly say who was the user trying to modify something and broke it. If somebody breaks something, usually they will not tell you, of course, about it. They will try to keep it a secret. So by separation of these roles, you can actually make sure that certain users do not have access to all of your backup systems. Now, the second option that can be actually used here, if you want to give your end users some sort of independence from backup administrators, because it sometimes happens that the backup admin is not only responsible for the backup, but is actually responsible for everything in the company. So if you think about having every single day, like, I don't know, 70 tickets from users saying, okay, I would like you to recover this file for me. I would like you to recover this machine for me because I cannot do it on my own. I'm just a regular user. Keep in mind that in Veeam, you can also present, let me log in here, you can also present those users with a web-based interface and allow them to actually do recoveries on their own. Now, the good thing about this is that with this web-based interface, you're actually able to separate users, giving them only access to their machines, which are, let's say, in their ownership, right? So if we add an account, we can have something we call the restore operator role right here. And once we click that, I can say that, for example, this user, let's say it's gonna be me, for example, I only have access to a vSphere machine, and the only machine which I'm allowed to do anything with it is this domain controller, nothing else, because I'm a domain controller admin in my organization. But you, as a backup administrator, you don't trust me enough to do recoveries of the entire machine. If you want to recover the entire machine, tell me, I know how to do it better, right? So I can give myself the option to only recover individual files from this machine. I can also specify that, for example, those files cannot be downloaded locally, but can only be recovered to its original location. So that way there is no security breach, for example, of a user logging into the infrastructure, let's say over some remote desktop, for example, from home, from their home laptop, and trying to download some files from our production servers. No. If I select this checkbox, the only thing that they are able to do is they are able to automatically send the data to its original location, so back to the domain controller and nowhere else. You cannot download it locally. If I don't trust this particular user enough, I can, for example, say that the only extension this user can actually recover is, for example, document. That's it, right? You have no access to anything else. The only files you'll be able to recover are documents. And this is pretty much it. Of course, we can go down deeper into specific application items, but let's not get into that much detail here. So this is something that can really help you because, first of all, yes, you do have this permission separation. But what other things you have to take into account? As I said, security can be quite difficult when it comes to Veeam. So one of those is the roles. So this is something I already mentioned, so I'll not get back to that. But there's also segmentation of the backup network. And again, this is something that I'm heavily guilty of because, again, because we are doing pre-sales work, those are usually POCs. And when you're doing a POC, you want the POC to be done as quickly as possible with as simple of a solution as possible because you want it to take just a couple of days. Let's be honest, nobody has time to test a solution for a year, for example, right? It's usually has to be done like within a month and that's it. But the good practice, like basically what should be done, and it's what's very rarely done, is segmentation of the backup infrastructure. So as you can see right here, there is a different management zone which contains only the backup server, so basically the brains of the operation. There is a demilitarized zone which contains other components which are used to connecting to our backup infrastructure. Trusted zone. So of course, in the trusted zone we have our production environment, but something that should be completely restricted, basically no access whatsoever unless it's fully necessary, are the backup repositories, right? Because backup repositories are your insurance policy. They're the place which you're going to go to in case any kind of disaster actually happens, right? So keep this in mind, that those network separations, although they're not that trivial to actually plan and deploy, they can be a lifesaver when you are actually hit by some sort of external malware. And again, I would say that maybe specific attacks are not that much of a problem, but ransomware infections, yes, we've seen quite a lot of them, not only of course with our customers, but even in our home environments or whatever. People, as soon as they see some sort of vSphere environment, they try to attack it if it's presented to the world. So yeah, this kind of separation, especially of those critical backup components, so especially of the backup repository which is storing your data, that's something that you have to take into account. There's one more thing on the previous slide, I believe, which I did not mention, 2 slides ago actually. Installing the Veeam components. If you put everything in a domain, it's very simple. I mean, I love putting everything in a domain, but again, keep in mind, I'm mostly dealing with demo and test environments. Putting production environment, everything in the domain, means that if your domain credentials are somewhat compromised, you're basically done for, right? Because those domain credentials will be used to access your Veeam Backup/Replication server. Those domain credentials will most likely encrypt your production virtual machines, and those same domain credentials will allow you access to your repositories, most likely encrypting this data as well. So the good practice, again, it's not convenient, but it's, well, good practice, not to have the backup solution in the domain. So if we're going into worst practices again, the worst practice that we see a lot of times, and I said again, I'm guilty of this, is putting everything in a domain. I understand why, because it's extremely simple to manage such a solution, but please do not do it if you are using Veeam as your production backup system. Second thing, well, and again, this really depends on the customer. There is no in between. We either go to customers and we see that everything is closed. So, dear Veeam team, please provide me with specific ports that have to be open in order to use your solution in our environment, because otherwise we are going to cut all the traffic, which is unnecessary. And those are, let's say, harder to work with, but from the security perspective, absolutely wonderful. And the best practice, okay, everything is open, everything should connect with one another. Yeah, no problem. Just, well, we don't care what ports you're operating on, it's going to work. So yes, from my perspective, absolutely wonderful, because that way I can just install every single component and not care about networking. From the perspective of actually maintaining this infrastructure of security from external threats, this is absolutely horrible. So in order to do it, of course, Veeam documents every single port, every single connection, what is actually required for us to make those components work. There's also a document, it's actually called the Veeam, it's a Veeam white paper. It's called the Hardening of the Veeam Infrastructure. It's a very cool read, because it's a document which is talking about version like 9.5, but not much has changed in terms of components. And it tells you exactly which components should run on which permissions, where should you separate, for example, accounts, which particular components should be in a domain, which should be in a work group. So this is a great document if you want to make sure that your data protection environment is actually meeting the good practice. So again, something from the worst practices perspective, do not open every single port in your infrastructure just because, for example, me from Veeam asks you to do so for a POC. Of course, I love it when everything is open, but not a good idea. Disaster recovery. So this is actually a difficult topic, because I would say number 6 is one of those elements which I fully understand why they are not deployed in your infrastructures. So basically, not having disaster recovery means that you do not use replication. You're not able just to switch between environments in case something goes wrong, right? As we said, it's called Veeam Backup and Replication. So of course, we have replication jobs. We're able to use those replicas, and replicas are extremely simple because if something goes wrong, the only thing you have to do is basically click failover. And immediately what's going to happen is that your secondary location, your disaster recovery site, is being booted up. Now, why do people not do it? Two reasons. One of them, people are not used to replication, but this is, let's say this is not the primary reason. The primary reason is that we do not have a secondary data center which is able to actually handle the workloads. Usually we have a primary data center. If we have a different data center, it's usually not for disaster recovery purposes. It's usually like active, just do two data centers exchanging data constantly. So of course, like it's not a good practice from our perspective because replicas are the fastest way to recover data. But this is something that I completely understand why this may be happening. Now, to mitigate this somehow, in version 10, I believe Mariusz was talking about this last week. Keep in mind that we introduced something like massive instant VM recovery. So you can choose a lot of virtual machines right now and just do instant recovery of those machines. Now, if you remember, instant VM recovery, hosting virtual machines directly from the backup infrastructure, which gives you a slightly higher RTO than replication, but it's not that much of a difference, right? So if you're not able to actually have this disaster recovery location because of infrastructure reasons, keep in mind, yes, this mechanism can actually work pretty much the same. But we also have customers who do have disaster recovery locations. They're just as powerful as their primary data centers, and they do not use replication. Well, because no, right? We always use backups, so we're not going to move to replicas right now because we know backups, we don't know replicas. And that's something I would not really recommend, because if a tool actually gives you this option, and with Veeam you always have replication, why not use it, right? It was designed for disaster recovery purposes. Not validating backups. So this is something, of course, strictly related to any Veeam product. It's any backup product, not necessarily a Veeam product. And we see this quite a lot. And again, that's something I understand because administrators are not able to test every single backup. However, what I do not understand is people who have Veeam in the Enterprise or Enterprise Plus edition, which have mechanisms to automatically verify backups, are still not doing this. I believe that's because if you look at the configuration of such jobs, they may seem intimidating in the very beginning, but in reality, it's quite simple. I mean, just at one point when you're installing Veeam Backup and Replication, you have to spend, let's say, half an hour. Let's make it a big amount of time, because perhaps you might have to call me, or you maybe have to call Bluebridge to assist you with that. But once you have this set up, it's basically like a pendulum. It's just going to work. So there's no additional reconfiguration needed whatsoever. But if you do not have such an automated solution, well, it basically requires time. It requires you to take those backups. It requires you to restore them. It requires you to do manual checks of those backups. Now, I'm not going to go over this slide. Let's switch to a demo again. And for those of you who may be aware or maybe are not aware, Veeam has a mechanism called Sure Backup. Now, what Sure Backup does actually is it creates an isolated network environment. Let me just create a quick drawing. Let's say we have two virtual machines which we are going to be testing, and we have a Veeam Backup Replication server right here. So what Veeam actually does is it creates a router between environments. So basically, it creates something we call the virtual lab. And this virtual lab creates a mimic of our production network, right? So whenever we want to test something, those machines are actually booted up from the backup, and they are booted in an isolated network, which is supposed to mimic your production network. So if you think about it, if you have, for example, the IP address of, let's say, 10, let's just make it simple, 5, right? You have like a 24-bit mask, and the gateway, of course, is going to be 10, 10, 10, 1. So what's going to happen in this isolated lab is Veeam is going to boot up a machine with the exactly same network address. Of course, the mask is also going to be, okay, I'll not, okay, I can change this. And exactly the same gateway. However, in this isolated lab, the gateway is going to be our virtual lab router machine. So this machine basically tries to leave the network, and our lab says, no, you cannot go over to the production network. I will not allow you to do that. So because there is the same IP addressing inside the lab, this machine can communicate, for example, with this machine. Not a problem, right? So if you want to test like an entire application, if you have, for example, a SharePoint farm where you have both the SQL backends and SharePoint frontends, for example, not a problem. Those machines can communicate with one another while still maintaining full separation from the production network, right? So very simple mechanism if you look at it, if you think about it, but it allows you to really achieve amazing things. Why? Because then when you run such tests, you can see right here, for example, we're going to check an Exchange server. Let's see what's going to happen here. So first of all, okay, we scan this for viruses. So this is something that also is worth mentioning. Veeam is able to actually integrate with your antivirus software, make sure that the contents of the backup are fully safe. Then we start a virtual machine from the backup file. So this is instant VM recovery. And the most important thing that's going to happen is we separate it on the network level. So basically, we switch the production network with the lab network. So that way we achieve full separation and we allow you to do any kind of tests on your machines. After that, well, it's basically a verification mechanism. So we make sure that the machine boots up. We make sure that internally within the lab, the IP address is exactly the same because those are retained. We make sure that externally, we actually put some network address translation. So we basically put a net over this. So externally, we can also access this machine, but it's not so trivial anymore. And we check heartbeat. So make sure that virtual machine connects to the virtualization host correctly. We check ping to make sure in case we have a disaster recovery that we are able to actually connect this virtual machine to the network. And after that, we can also check applications. So for example, in our case, this is checking a mail server, which is basically listening if this specific server is listening on port 2025 in our particular case. So a simple script, but very much possible. And this is automated. Once you define this task, there is a scheduler, so every single time you run a backup, after this backup is created, you can immediately verify if this backup is recoverable. So it does not really take any additional time from you as an administrator. So amazing, works for vSphere, works for Hyper-V, works for replicas in vSphere. So basically any kind of recovery point can be verified here. Okay, so we are down to last 4. No distributing of components. And this is something that's quite controversial when it comes to the worst practices versus best practices, because not distributing components in a small environment is not a bad practice at all. And it's something I fully understand. If you're looking at perspective, one of the largest banks in Poland, one of the largest Veeam customers in Poland, does not have distributed Veeam components. They just put a huge server. I believe they have like, I don't know, 4 CPUs. I believe it's like 16 cores each. And they have like 256 gigabytes of RAM within this machine. And that's it, right? They decided, okay, I don't want additional components because it's going to be harder to handle. So they just have this all-in-one infrastructure. Now, would we recommend it? No. Does it work? Yes, of course it works. It really all depends on what you are trying to get from your backup infrastructure. Right, so the best practice of course from Veeam would be to distribute those components, even though you can have an all-in-one solution. If you have an all-in-one solution, the only thing to remember right here is that not only we are running a SQL database, but you're also running a service which is responsible for compressing the duplicating data. You're also running a service which is this one is quite intensive on the CPU. This one is quite intensive on the RAM usage because the repository server is basically taking care of the duplication between different proxy servers. Of course, there's the server, the backup replication server itself. There's the operating system underneath. So it has to be quite a powerful machine to make sure that all all of this is going to be running smoothly during the backup, right? So as I said, the good practice would be to make sure that everything is going to be separated. Now, if you look, the next slide is going to be quite a shocker because it's quite a big environment, but a very good practice would look something like this, that if you have two locations, so you can see right here, we have site A, site B. So we basically have a Veeam Backup Replication server right here for backup purposes. There is a second one for replication purposes. As you can see, we have proxy servers right here. So basically for compressing the duplicating data on each side, because we want compression and deduplication to be handled locally. And then we have a site C, which is basically like a disaster recovery location, where basically the only thing we are having is a bunch of repositories. So splitting those components, again, it can make sense. It really does make sense if you have different locations, if you have a couple locations, if you want to store data between the sites. If you would like to send, if for example you have two vSphere environments, one is site A, for example, in Vilnius, I don't know, the second one, let's say in Klaipėda, for example, having an all-in-one solution is not the best practice, right? It's actually bad practice. Why? Because, okay, let's say you deployed everything in Vilnius and you still have some infrastructure in Klaipėda. You would have to download all the data from your offsite infrastructure without any compression, without any deduplication, most likely going over some slower link. So it's going to simply extend the time it takes for your backups to complete. So whenever you are able to put Veeam components as close to the infrastructure as possible, it is fully recommended, right? If not, again, keep in mind, it is considered a bad practice in Veeam, but again, I do understand why this might happen. Resource scheduling. This is something that is actually quite difficult, and I will actually combine these two. So number 3, resource allocation, as well as Veeam retention properties. Now, again, I will switch to my lab. And if you're looking at the question, will my backups fit? Because this is one of the biggest problems with backup solution. We are getting asked, okay, how much space will I need for my backups? And we're always saying, okay, tell me your data protection policy. I can estimate it for you. Because it happened to me once, actually, during a test implementation, that we had 10 terabytes of source data for backup. The customer wanted a 30-day retention for the tests and gave me 200 gigabytes of backup repository. So basically, I was like, okay, dear customer, thank you for the 200 gigabytes. It's absolutely not possible for me to fit 30 days of retention of 10 terabytes of data into 200 gigabytes. Of course, there's compression, there's the duplication, but they do not work that well. So to help you with this, there's actually the website, which I hope everybody, well, even if you don't know it, you will know it by now. It's called the Restore Point Simulator. It was created by one of our engineers. Now I will switch to it. So Restore Point Simulator, amazing tool. Why? Because it allows you to estimate the amount of data you are going to have to store on your backup repositories. So let's say how much data I have in my environment. Let's say I have 5 terabytes of data. I'm going to be running an incremental backup job, no problem. My retention policy, let's make it 30 days. Or basically, I was talking about 10 terabytes. Let's go with 10 terabytes of data. I will show you what the customer saw as the requirement for the backup data. Now, change rate. It really depends on what kind of systems you're running. Let's say it's an environment where you maybe have only one database server, the rest are quite static machines. By default, if something is not a database server, it's 5% daily should be enough. Compression and deduplication. Okay, by default, we specify it's going to be ×2, so we are going to reduce the data by half. In reality, I believe we can do a little bit more. So let's say we're optimistic, we're going to do it 2.5 times. Now, keep in mind, Veeam data compression and deduplication works on a per job level. If you need global deduplication, if you need deduplication between different full backups, a deduplication appliance is not a bad solution, right? So if you think about dedicated appliances, like for example, a store ones or a data domain or whatever, those can give you global deduplication for this long-term retention. Veeam, well, we do not go into this. There are simply solutions that can do it better, and they're hardware-based solutions, which are basically created for those purposes. So, okay, 10 terabytes of data, 30 days, 5% change rate. Let's say we are able to do 40% reduction of the backups. Do we do any additional full backups? Let's say no. Let's say no. So I'm going to have my data protection policy looking that I have one full backup and I have 29 incrementals. Can you guess? Oh, and also one more thing, because data grows with time, right? Basically, we increase the amount of data, we do not decrease it. So let's say in a year, it's a small change, but I'm going to have 5% more data. Usually it's a lot more. Okay, let's run a simulation. Remember, 10 terabytes of data, 30 days retention, and I need a total basically of 15 terabytes. If I would like to be safe, if I would like to make sure that all my backups will fit, right? And this is considering I only have a single full backup file. So imagine my surprise when I got 200 gigabytes as a backup repository and I showed this to the customer saying, okay, that's how much data I actually need. Data really does take space. If I want to be super safe, so for example, every single week I would like a full backup to be completed. So let's say every Saturday I want a full backup to be completed. Now see what's going to happen. Remember, full backups do not deduplicate inside Veeam. You need an external solution to be able to do this. Immediately, we're jumping to pretty much 35 terabytes of data, which is going to be required to store your backups. So this tool is amazing because it does give you this, let's say, point of reference. Of course, it will vary because of the type of data that you're going to be having, but keep in mind, it can really save you. So rps.devin.me. I believe we can also send you the link to this later. Great solution to estimate the amount of data that you're going to need. And pretty much the last option. So air gap. This is a worst practice that we actually introduced, I would say, 2 or 3 years ago when ransomware was becoming more and more popular, right? Air gap, well, this is something that everybody knows is required. It makes your data safe. So this is why tapes are absolutely amazing. But there are certain things that can be done even if we're not able to provide a full air gap solution, just to make sure that the Veeam infrastructure is going to be safer. Now, if you think about it, the simplest thing you can think of is, for example, having a Veeam repository server. So this is a repository server. And this repository server, well, for example, you can have 2 different storages attached to it. So one of them, for example, local, and one of them in offsite location. And that way, Veeam can do replication of data between those 2 locations. Now, is it simple? Yes. Is it a good idea? Absolutely not, because those storages are going to be connected over what? Maybe, I don't know, iSCSI, maybe it's going to be SMB. Basically, widely known protocols which are very susceptible to any kind of attacks because everybody knows them. Now, to make this very simple scenario safer, what you can do is create a Veeam repository, and attach those storages to separate repositories. So that way, the communication right here happens over the Veeam transport protocol. And finding ransomware, finding malware which is going to target specifically Veeam protocols used for transferring data, that's not so simple, right? I honestly, personally have not heard of any up until now, at least. So maybe such exist. I'm not saying they do not, but it's much harder to create specific software, specific malware to attack a Veeam transport agent rather than attack just a simple, let's say, repository which is presenting over iSCSI or SMB, for example. So small things, but just locking yourself into some particular protocol can be very beneficial in here. Of course, this is not a true air gap. So what some of our customers are actually doing is when they are starting a backup job, as a pre-job script, so basically as soon as the job starts, they send a script to their firewall, I would say, I don't know, let's call it command server. This firewall command center is opening the connectivity between locations, backup happens, and as soon as the backup job completes, as a post-job script, the firewall is blocking the connectivity between the 2 environments again. So you only have this open connection during the backup process. After this, everything is being locked out. Is it perfect? Of course, it's not. Is it better than nothing? Absolutely, because you are just exposing your infrastructure for the duration of the backup. So small things that can work if you do not have tape, if you're not able, for example, to use object storage somewhere in the cloud, and generally object storage is considered to be safer. But if you only have block-based repositories, there are ways for you to do this better. Unfortunately, as I said, the most common scenario is this. So basically one repository server, basically all the storage is connected to it. And once this repository server gets infected, you're basically done for, because it's going to spread across every single backup storage that you have already defined. So keep this in mind. Simple things, but I believe something that can be, let's say, maybe implemented in your backup solutions. Maybe if you're thinking about Veeam, that's something you can take into consideration when you are designing your infrastructure. But all of those options will allow you to have a better backup solution. Now, keep in mind, again, it might happen that you will never need those designs. Maybe you will never be attacked by ransomware, so you're going to be thinking that, okay, why did I spend money on those additional servers? Why did I complicate my infrastructure? But it's not a discussion of if I'm going to be attacked. It's a discussion of, can I afford to be attacked and have my backup infrastructure not ready for such attacks? Let's be honest, it basically goes down to all of this. Okay, so that's going to be it from my side. Again, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully, I was able to pass some useful information to you. And again, if you are using some of the practices, which I consider to be the worst practices in here, but you do this fully aware, keep in mind it's not necessarily a bad practice. If you're aware of the repercussions, if it's a design which was basically forced upon you by budgeting or infrastructure level restrictions, it's fine, as long as you know what are possible consequences of such designs. So again, thank you very much, and I believe, Miroslav, I can give you back the presentation.
Thank you, Tomek, for your presentation. And ačiū labai uždėmesį. Jeigu yra klausimų, rašykit. Jeigu ne, tai dar kartelį dėkoju uždėmesį ir laukiam jūsų sekančią savaitę. Geros dienos.